Hello, 11. This is an important lesson. This is where we examine why did the Nazis become popular in the period 1929 to 1932. If you see the graph in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, you can see this shows the seats in the Reichstag that the Nazis gained at each election. You can see in 1928 they have very little support. They get very few votes and therefore return very few MPs or members of parliament to the German Reichstag. But you'll see after 1928 there is a huge turnaround for the Nazis where they increase their vote share massively and therefore increase the number of MPs that they have in the German Reichstag until they become by far the biggest party in Germany. We have to understand the factors that lead to this. And obviously, the first factor that we looked at yesterday will be the impact of the Great Depression on the Weimar government. But that's a monocausal explanation. That doesn't satisfy us. We need a more complex explanation. So we're going to look at the other factors that made Hitler uniquely able to exploit the problems of the Great Depression. And that's going to be talked through on the next few slides. Okay, so historians have identified three big reasons or factors that explain why the Nazis became a much more popular party in Germany after 1929. So number one, obviously the mistakes of the Weimar government sent the voters towards the extreme parties, and the Nazis benefit greatly from this. But there's also, number two, the appeal of the Nazis through their beliefs and the personality of their leader, Adolf Hitler. And finally, number three, the tactics the Nazis used, which gave them a huge profile over the Depression years. And we're going to examine each of these in turn. So this is just a recap on what we looked at the other day. So what were the mistakes of the Weimar government that sent voters looking for an alternative? So firstly, they embarked on unpopular policies in an effort to solve the Great Depression. So the government tried to come up with a policy to solve the Depression. They were frightened of causing inflation again, like they had done in 1923-24. So they didn't want to spend too much government money. Instead, they tried to make German goods cheaper in the hope that people would buy them. German industry becomes more competitive. German industry gets better. Unemployment gets better, people have more money, and it spirals into a recovery. So to do this, they cut wages, cut government jobs, and reduced unemployment benefit. But sadly, this made things worse in the short term. And then we have presidential rule. The government in charge, when the Depression took hold, couldn't decide on how best to deal with it. So Muller, the Chancellor, resigned, and following the end of Muller's coalition, Brüning was made Chancellor, and his cuts to spending were very unpopular, and he was nicknamed the Hungry Chancellor. Literally, the German people in this time were so poor that they were starving. More importantly, the president allowed him to use Article 48 to pass laws as he saw fit, making democracy look like a sham. If you recall, Article 48 was a clause in the Constitution that would allow the president, only in times of emergency, to pass laws without the support of the German parliament, the Reichstag. So because Brüning, the Chancellor, didn't have support in parliament for his policies of cutting government jobs, cutting wages, etc., he had to go to the president who supported him in this and allowed him to pass those laws over the Reichstag using Article 48. So again, in Germany, that made the people believe that democracy was broken, that it wasn't working. And effectively, after 1930, there was no democracy in Germany because the president was allowing the Chancellor Brüning to rule without support from the Reichstag. Okay, so we need to start getting some of this information into our books. So you need a clean double page. At the top of the page, write the heading, a diagram to show why support for the Nazis grew 1929 to 33. In the center of the page, just put the circle with 3 big reasons, and then as you see in my example here, just spiral out from that circle with number 1, the mistakes of the Weimar government sent the voters towards the extreme parties on the left. Number 2, the appeal of the Nazis through the beliefs and the personality of Hitler on the right. And just underneath, the tactics the Nazis used, which gave them a high profile over the Depression years. Remember to write small, because you're going to need a lot of space around to record our findings. And what I've done for you is I've completed notes that develop point 1, the mistakes of the Weimar government. So you can see it made democracy look like a waste of time. So Chancellor Brüning did not have support for his policies, so Hindenburg allowed him to govern using Article 48. In times of emergency, laws could be passed without the Parliament, and obviously we have the unpopular policies. The President was frightened of inflation, so refused to support Chancellor Müller, who wanted to spend government money to create jobs. Instead, he supported Chancellor Brüning, who wanted to cut wages, government jobs and benefits in the hope of making German industry more profitable. These policies made the situation in the short term worse. So effectively, you need to make a nice, neat copy of what you see on this screen, and then we'll look at how we can do the other developments independently next. Okay, so now we've got 1/3 of our diagram complete. We need to look at developing the other factors that explain why support for the Nazis grew 29 to 33. So now we're going to move to factor 2, and that's the appeal of the Nazis through the beliefs and the personality of Hitler. And there's 4 things we need to explore here, and we're going to look at them on the next slide. Okay, so why did the German people turn to the Nazis as a solution for their problems during the Great Depression? Number 1, we cannot ignore the personality and role of Hitler. Hitler to Germans was young, Hitler was a good speaker, Hitler wanted nothing to do with democracy, Hitler promised one-man rule, and Germany had been great when it had been governed by one man, the Kaiser. And Hitler, to many Germans, was just an ordinary man, so they believed he understood ordinary people's problems. And Hitler was also anti-communist. The Nazis were very clear about their hatred of the communists, and many Germans, after 1929, were frightened of communism, yet the communists were getting lots of votes. So Hitler and the Nazis looked like a good bet against the communists. Remember, the communist agenda would be to share wealth equally within Germany, and that would obviously damage the middle classes. It would damage the wealthy. So they were looking for a party that would be a good bet against communist rule in Germany, and the Nazis looked like the best bet. And also organization and discipline. The Depression had brought a lot of violence and unrest with it. So there was crime on the streets, there was unrest on the streets, there were riots, there were protests. So even though the Nazis were behind a lot of this, many people were impressed by the marching and the uniforms of the SA. Remember, Hitler's brown shirts, his private army. They promised order in the middle of chaos. And finally, simple messages. The Nazis did not produce complicated and detailed policies for the voters to consider. In fact, they made few detailed promises at all. Their simple and vague messages seemed like an easy answer to Germany's difficult problems. In a sense, they just promised to make Germany great again, and the German people bought into this. Does that sound familiar? So here we've just got some images, and these kind of reminders of the factors that I've just explained. So the central photograph is Hitler surrounded by his SA, his paramilitary group, his brown shirts. You can see the flags, you can see the militarism, you can see him projecting the strength and the organization and the discipline that appealed to so many German people. And on the right hand side, you've got an example of Nazi propaganda from the elections of 1930, 1932. And this is a very simple message. The German translation into English, or the English translation from the German, is very simple. It is just a promise of work and bread. Essentially, you vote Nazi, we will get you a job, we will stop your hunger, we will cure the problems in Germany. Nothing complex there. Okay, now you simply need to take those 4 ideas and add them to your mind map, linked to point 2, the appeal of the Nazis. Okay, now we move on to the final bit of our explanation and our diagram as to why the support for the Nazis grew in 1929 to 33. And the final bit is the unique tactics the Nazis used, which gave them a higher profile than any other political party in the Depression years. And this can't be ignored. This was a significant factor in why the Nazis would attract support rather than other political parties in Germany in this period. So the Nazis had special tactics which gave them an advantage over the other parties. Firstly, targeting the voters. One of the most important things the Nazis did was to aim their election propaganda at specific groups of people. This is called targeting the voters. It was easy for the Nazis to do this because the Gauss system, which we've already looked at in the 1920s, helped them to talk about individual issues in specific areas. In other words, they could make promises according to what the people wanted. And we also have energetic campaigning. The Nazis were extremely energetic when it came to campaigning for votes. They held lots of meetings and marched in the streets. And in July 1932, uniquely, Hitler used a plane to get him to as many places as possible. The campaign was called Hitler over Germany. None of the other politicians did this. This enabled Hitler to get his message across Germany in a way that other politicians and other political parties could not do. And finally, violence and force. The Nazis made no secret of the fact that they were prepared to use violence against their political enemies. These were mostly members of the KPD, the Communist Party, and the SPD, a socialist party in Germany. Unemployment had brought a lot of unrest to German towns, and many people were afraid of the crowds of jobless young men who drifted into town and hung around street corners. So they fought the Nazis with their SA, their paramilitary organization, would sort them out. So this is just a reminder of the Gauss system, how Hitler was able to target the voters. You can see Germany is a huge country, but the Nazis divided it up into key districts that they called Gau. And within those Gau, they had an extensive system whereby they could understand what the concerns were in that particular area and therefore target their propaganda appropriately to maximize the number of votes they could get. This was really sophisticated for the 1930s. So your final task to complete this diagram and show your understanding of the 3 factors that increase support for the Nazis is just to complete the final annotations of the tactics the Nazis used, which gave them a high profile over the Depression years. Thank you.